In this chapter, we will focus on gaining power and influence. After learning this chapter, you should be able to enhance your personal and position power, use influence to accomplish exceptional work, and neutralize inappropriate influence. Before we discuss power, we need to define power. Power in general describes an individual's capacity to influence others' behaviors. When linking power to workplace, previous research has shown that effective managers are those who use power and political behavior properly. It is important to note that effective use of managerial power represents helping subordinates accomplish their tasks. Although the vast majority of research has argued that the effective use of power is one of the most critical elements of managerial success, some have suggested that managerial power can be detrimental when it is used for personal achievement and domination. On the other hand, the positive view of managerial power suggests that effective use of power can lead to positive outcomes such as task accomplishment. There are several advantages of exercising managerial power effectively. For instance, effective use of managerial power helps mobilize resources to accomplish productive work in organizations, obtain crucial information, and resolve interpersonal issues. When there is abuse of power, it can derail a manager's career. On this PowerPoint slide, you can find some characteristics of managers who abuse power. Although the discussion of power has been ongoing, we need to recognize current trends in power. First, because organizations are becoming less hierarchical, managers must yield influence to lower level employees in order to get the work done. Second, because of the advancement in technology, the flow of information has changed from one-way to two-way. This implies that managers need to provide employees with more power and discretion when making decisions. Third, it is also because of technology, organizations are making structural shift to boundaryless structures such as virtual organizations that consist of a network of different organizations. The boundaryless structure implies that the nature of traditional authority has changed to empowerment. Finally, because there is an increase in smaller organizations, each of the employees in these smaller organizations is highly visible and makes his or her unique contribution. Therefore, the traditional ways of managing employees have changed from centralized control to empowerment. A commonly asked question in the power literature is the sources of power. In general, there are two major sources of power. The first is human capital, which refers to an individual's personal ability and competencies. For instance, if you know the answer to a problem, you have human capital. The second is social capital, which refers to an individual's social connection within and outside an organization. For instance, if you know someone who knows the answer to a problem, you have social capital. If we further explore sources of power at the personal level, we can classify personal power into four sources. First, personal power can come from your task-relevant knowledge or experience. This means that you are able to influence others' behaviors when they need to apply your work-related knowledge. The second source of personal power is personal attraction. In other words, others follow you because you possess desirable characteristics associated with friendship. For instance, your charisma or physical characteristics can create attraction, which leads to personal power. Next, your higher than expected commitment of time can result in personal power because others perceive that you are dependable and reliable. Finally, legitimacy can create personal power through others' acceptance. For instance, because police officers have legitimate authority, our acceptance of their legitimate power then affects our behaviors. In addition to personal power, power can come from position. For instance, if you occupy a position that has access to information that is generally not available to others, you have position power through centrality. Your flexibility in exercising your own judgment is related to position power. Specifically, if you have high latitude to improvise, to innovate, or to demonstrate initiative, you have position power through flexibility. Next, your visibility, which refers to the degree to which your task performance is seen by influential people in the organization. In other words, you have position power through visibility if you normally interact with a number of influential people in your organization. Finally, your relevance, which refers to whether your task activities are associated directly with the central objectives and issues in an organization. So far, we have discussed sources of power. Our attention now is paid to transforming power into influence. It is important to understand that the purpose of transforming power into influence is not to gain power for our own sake. The main purpose of power and influence is to help others accomplish the exceptional in organizations. By doing so, we become influential as well as powerful. Generally speaking, power is transformed into influence when the target consents to behave according to the desires of the power holder. Thus, the influence strategies can be classified into three categories. The first is called retribution, which refers to forcing others to do what you say. Thus, retribution is based upon personal threat that generally stems from formal positions, titles, status, and authority. The second is called reciprocity, which operates on the principle of satisfying the self-interest of both parties. Therefore, reciprocity involves bargaining that allows each party to gain something and give up something. The third is called reason, which involves helping others to see why your idea makes sense. Thus, reason strategy allows the target to see values and needs for doing something. It is important to know that there are pros and cons of each of the influence strategies. The emphasis is on when to use each of these influence strategies, which will be our next discussion. On this slide, you can find appropriate situational context where retribution is the most effective influence strategy. For instance, because retribution involves the use of coercion and intimidation, it is an appropriate strategy that can correct serious violations of organizational policies. On this slide, you can see some appropriate situations where reciprocity is an effective influence strategy. For instance, when both parties understand and accept the existence of mutual dependence, using social obligations and favor exchanging can be an effective tool to influence others' behavior. On this slide, you can find some appropriate situations where reason is an effective influence strategy. For instance, when there is a common goal in the end, Each of the parties can align their self-interest by providing the other party with facts and discussing the needs for doing something. It is important to emphasize that subordinates can exercise upward influence. Specifically, issue selling is a special case of the reason strategy that involves a subordinate convincing his or her boss that a particular issue requires the boss' attention. In many cases, this is an opportunity for subordinates to help their leaders and subsequently themselves become more successful by bringing in important issues or ideas to their attention. This involves leading up by speaking up skillfully. When others use power and influence in ways that are not appropriate, then we as the recipient of the influence must be able to neutralize these unwanted behaviors. The same applies to situations involving an abusive boss. Therefore, subordinates in these situations must become skilled in resisting inappropriate uses of power and influence. Neutralizing retribution strategies used by others may involve, first, using countervailing power to shift dependency to interdependency. This involves attempts to equalize or balance power in relationships. Second, confronting the individual directly, explaining the problem in terms of behaviors, consequences, and feelings. Finally, actively resisting as the last approach. This involves deliberate non-compliance or escalating to a more senior manager. Neutralizing reciprocity strategies used by others may involve, first, examining the intent of any gift or favor-giving activity by speculating about the other person's motives, observing the appropriateness of their behavior or the probable consequences of their actions. Second, confronting individuals who are using manipulative bargaining tactics, stating your disapproval and suggesting an alternative exchange. Finally, refusing to bargain with individuals who use high-pressure tactics. This is used as the last approach after the first two strategies have failed. Neutralizing reason strategies used by others may involve, first, explaining the adverse effects of compliance on performance. However, it is important to acknowledge the other person's needs, explain your concerns, and suggest an alternative. Second, defending your personal rights when trying to reason fails. This may involve appealing to a basic sense of fairness or a right to say no. Finally, refusing to comply with a request when other strategies have failed. You can engage in some behavioral practices to enhance your power and influence. For instance, you should be attentive to what contextual environment you are in and determine if the use of a particular source of personal power helps you influence others' behavioral tendencies. It is also helpful that you understand reason, reciprocity, and retribution strategies and the appropriate context to use each of these strategies. Finally, being able to influence your boss through issue selling allows you to exercise power and influence in an upward direction.